The sun rises over the horns of Hattin on July 4th, 1187. 20,000 Christian knights and soldiers find themselves surrounded. There is no water, no escape, and the Muslim army has set the dry grass on fire. The smoke chokes them. The heat bakes them in their armor. This is not how they imagined their holy war would end. But this disaster didn't start on a hilltop in Galilee. It started with a broken promise, a stolen caravan, and one man who couldn't control his greed. Reginald of Chatillon was a problem. Everyone knew it. Even his fellow crusaders whispered that he was reckless, violent, and stupid. He'd been a prisoner of the Muslims for 16 years after a failed raid. 16 years in a dark cell should have taught him something about picking fights he couldn't win. It didn't. In 1186, Reginald controlled a massive fortress called Kerak. It sat right on the trade route between Egypt and Damascus. Muslim caravans passed by his walls every week, loaded with silk, spices, gold, and pilgrims heading to Mecca. Reginald watched them pass. He watched all that wealth roll by, and he couldn't help himself. He attacked a caravan, not just any caravan, one that carried Saladin's own sister. Now, Saladin was not a man who forgave insults. As Sultan of Egypt and Syria, he had spent years uniting the Muslim world, city by city, treaty by treaty, and when necessary, battle by battle. He was patient. He was smart. He had been waiting for the perfect excuse to destroy the Crusader kingdoms once and for all. Reginald just handed him that excuse. But here's the thing. There was a truce. King Guy of Jerusalem had signed a peace treaty with Saladin. When Saladin heard about the attack, he didn't rush to war. He sent a message to King Guy. Simple request: punish Reginald. Return what was stolen, keep the peace. King Guy tried. He rode to Kerak himself and demanded Reginald return the loot. Reginald looked at his king and said no. Just no. He didn't care about the treaty. He didn't care about the consequences. He kept everything. Saladin got his answer. The truce was dead, and he called his armies. By spring of 1187, Saladin had gathered the largest Muslim army the Crusaders had ever seen. Around 12,000 cavalry, 20,000 infantry, warriors from Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and beyond. They assembled near Damascus, and then they marched west toward the Kingdom of Jerusalem. King Guy panicked. He called every fighting man in his kingdom to assemble at a place called Safaria. It was a good position, plenty of water from springs, high ground, defensible. The Christian army gathered there, 20,000 men, nearly every knight and soldier the kingdom could spare. If they lost this army, they lost everything. The commanders argued about what to do. Some wanted to stay at Safaria, wait for Saladin to come to them, fight on ground they chose, with water at their backs. Others wanted to march out and meet Saladin head-on, show strength, take the fight to the enemy. Raymond of Tripoli was the loudest voice for caution. He was one of the most experienced commanders in the kingdom. He'd fought Saladin before. He knew the land. He knew the heat. He understood what happened to armies that marched through the desert in July without water. He begged King Guy to stay put. But Reginald and another commander named Gerard de Ridefort pushed for attack. They called Raymond a coward. They said waiting made them look weak. They whispered that Raymond might even be a traitor, that he'd grown too friendly with the Muslims during his own time as a prisoner. King Guy was weak. He was new to the throne. He'd only become king because he married the right woman. Nobody really respected him. He was terrified of looking like a coward. So when his commanders questioned his courage, he made the worst decision of his life. He ordered the army to march. On July 3rd, the Christian army left Safaria. They marched east, toward the town of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee. Saladin had attacked Tiberias the day before. It was bait. Raymond's own wife was trapped in the fortress there, and Saladin knew the Christians couldn't ignore it. The march was hell from the start. July in Galilee is brutal. The sun hammers down. The ground is dust and rock. There are no trees for shade. The soldiers wore chainmail and padded cloth underneath. The knights wore full armor. Imagine wearing a metal oven in 100-degree heat. They had some water when they started. It didn't last. The route had a few springs, but Saladin's cavalry got there first. Saladin's forces poisoned the wells or filled them with stones. They positioned archers to shoot anyone who approached, and they never stopped harassing the Christian column. Muslim horse archers would ride close, shoot arrows into the marching soldiers, then gallop away before the knights could respond. The Christians couldn't catch them. They couldn't stop them. They could only keep walking and keep dying. By afternoon, the army was desperate. Soldiers were collapsing from heat. Horses were dying. King Guy wanted to push through to the Sea of Galilee. Just a few more miles. Water was right there. But Saladin was faster. His army moved ahead and blocked the road. The Christians couldn't go forward. They couldn't go back. And night was coming. Raymond begged the king to push through. Fight now while they still had strength. Reach the water or die trying. But the army was exhausted. The soldiers couldn't take another step. King Guy made his second terrible decision. He ordered the army to stop and camp for the night. They stopped at a place called the Horns of Hattin, 2 small hills that looked like horns. No water, no shade, just rocks and dry grass. The Muslim army surrounded them in the darkness. The Christians could hear them out there, drums, chanting, the sound of thousands of men preparing for battle. Some soldiers tried to sneak away in the night to find water. Saladin's men caught them and killed them. Others just sat and prayed. They knew what was coming. When the sun rose on July 4th, the Christians were already beaten. They hadn't slept. They hadn't drunk water in almost a day. The heat was already rising. And then Saladin gave an order that broke them completely. Set the grass on fire. The dry brush around the horns of Hattin went up like kindling. The wind blew smoke into the Christian lines. Men choked and coughed. Their eyes burned. They couldn't see. They couldn't breathe. And through the smoke came arrows. Thousands of arrows. The Muslim archers shot into the smoke, and the Christians couldn't even see where the arrows were coming from. The Christian army tried to form up for battle. The infantry bunched together with their shields. The knights mounted their horses for a charge, but there was no order, no plan, just desperation. Raymond of Tripoli led the first charge. He took his cavalry and rode straight at the Muslim lines. It was suicide, but it was the only chance. Maybe they could break through. Maybe some of them could escape. Saladin saw them coming. He ordered his men to open a gap in the line. Raymond and his knights charged through. They expected a fight. Instead, the Muslims just let them pass. Then they closed the gap behind them. Raymond was through. He was alive. He could have kept riding, but he looked back and saw the trap. His charge hadn't broken anything. Saladin had just let him go. The rest of the army was still trapped, and now they had no cavalry to protect them. Raymond didn't ride back. He couldn't. The gap was closed. Some say he was a coward for leaving. Others say he was smart to survive. Either way, he rode away from the battle and never forgave himself. Back on the hill, the Christian infantry was dying. The heat, the smoke, the thirst, the arrows. Men dropped their weapons and tried to surrender. Saladin's soldiers killed some and captured others. The knights tried to rally around King Guy and the True Cross. The True Cross was a piece of wood that Christians believed came from the cross Jesus died on. It was the holiest relic in the kingdom. Bishops carried it into battle as a symbol of God's protection. Losing it was unthinkable. The knights formed a circle around the king and the cross. They dismounted because their horses were dead or dying. They locked shields and prepared to die fighting. Saladin's men pressed in from all sides. The Christians fought hard. They were trained warriors, the best in the world at close combat. But they were outnumbered, exhausted, and dying of thirst. One by one they fell. The bishop carrying the true cross went down. A Muslim soldier grabbed the cross and held it high. The Christians saw it and despair broke them. If God's own cross could be captured, then God had abandoned them. King Guy fought until he couldn't lift his sword. Then he surrendered. Reginald of Châtillon was captured. Gérard de Riedfort was captured. Almost every noble and knight in the kingdom was either dead or in chains. Saladin had won the most complete victory any Muslim commander had ever achieved against the Crusaders. Out of 20,000 Christians, only a few thousand escaped. The rest were dead or captured. After the battle, Saladin set up his tent and brought the prisoners before him. He gave King Guy water. This was a message. In Muslim culture, if you give a prisoner food or water, you promise not to kill them. Guy drank and then passed the cup to Reginald. Saladin stopped him. He told Guy that he had given the water, not Saladin. Reginald would get nothing from him. Saladin looked at Reginald. This was the man who broke the truce, who attacked pilgrims, who insulted Saladin's family. Saladin had promised to kill Reginald with his own hands if he ever captured him. He kept his promise. Saladin drew his sword and struck Reginald. He didn't kill him with one blow. He wounded him and let his guards finish it. King Guy watched in terror, thinking he was next. Saladin told him to relax. Kings don't kill kings, but men like Reginald, they get what they deserve. The other nobles were ransomed. Their families paid fortunes to get them back. The common soldiers were sold as slaves, thousands of them. So many that the slave markets in Damascus couldn't handle them all. Prices dropped to almost nothing. The knights of the military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, were treated differently. Saladin saw them as fanatics who would never stop fighting for their cause, making them a continuous military threat. As such, they were too dangerous to ransom and release. Saladin had them executed. Some chroniclers estimate that around 200 knights were beheaded on Saladin's orders, though the exact number is uncertain. But the battle itself was just the beginning. The real disaster for the Crusaders came next. With the army destroyed, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was defenseless. Every castle, every city, every town had sent its soldiers to Hattin. Now those places had no one to protect them. Saladin knew it. He moved fast. Within days, he captured Tiberias, then Acre, the greatest port in the kingdom, then Jaffa, then Sidon, then Beirut. City after city surrendered without a fight. They had no choice. There was no army coming to save them. By September, Saladin stood outside the walls of Jerusalem itself, the holiest city in Christianity, the whole reason the Crusades existed. It had been in Christian hands for 88 years. Now it was about to fall. Jerusalem had almost no soldiers. The queen was inside with a handful of knights and a few thousand civilians. They couldn't win. Everyone knew it, but they were terrified of what would happen if they surrendered. They remembered what the Crusaders had done when they captured Jerusalem in 1099. The Crusaders had massacred everyone. Muslims, Jews, even some Christians. They killed for days. The streets ran with blood. It was one of the worst atrocities of the Middle Ages. The people inside Jerusalem in 1187 expected the same treatment. Saladin offered terms: surrender peacefully and everyone could leave alive. They just had to pay a ransom. 10 dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, 2 for a child. Anyone who couldn't pay would become a slave. The city surrendered. Saladin kept his word. There was no massacre, no revenge. He let the Christians leave. Thousands of them walked out of the city, carrying what they could. Some paid their ransom, Some couldn't and were enslaved, but nobody was slaughtered in the streets. This shocked Europe. A Muslim leader had shown more mercy than the Christian Crusaders had. It didn't fit the story they'd been told about savage infidels. Some people didn't believe it. Others were ashamed, but everyone agreed on one thing. They had to take Jerusalem back. The fall of Jerusalem triggered the Third Crusade. Kings from across Europe took up the cross. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. The greatest warriors in Christendom marched east to fight Saladin. But that's another story. The Battle of Hattin had already changed everything. It proved that the Crusader kingdoms could be destroyed. It showed that Saladin was a military genius, and it revealed that the Christians' greatest enemy wasn't Saladin's army, it was their own pride and stupidity. So what made Saladin's victory so complete? How did he destroy an army that was just as large as his own, led by experienced knights, fighting for their holy land and their God? First, he understood his enemy. Saladin knew the Crusaders were brave but arrogant. He knew they would see an attack on Tiberias as bait they couldn't refuse. He knew their commanders would argue. He knew King Guy was weak and could be pressured into a bad decision. Saladin didn't just fight the Christian army, he manipulated it into destroying itself. Second, he controlled the terrain. The march from Saphoria to Tiberias crossed dry, open ground with few water sources. Saladin made sure his men reached those sources first. He turned the landscape into a weapon. The Christians weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting the desert, the heat, and their own thirst. Third, he was patient. Saladin could have attacked the Christian army at Saphoria. It would have been a hard fight, maybe one he'd lose. Instead, he waited. He let the Christians come to him. He let the march weaken them. He let the heat and thirst do half his work. By the time the battle started, the Christians were already beaten. Fourth, he used his cavalry perfectly. Muslim horse archers were faster and more mobile than Christian knights. They could shoot from a distance and retreat before the knights could catch them. At Hattin, they harassed the Christian column for hours, killing men and horses without ever committing to a full fight. When the Christians finally stopped to camp, they were exhausted and demoralized. The actual battle the next morning was just the finishing blow. And fifth, Saladin knew when to be ruthless and when to be merciful. He executed Reginald and the military order knights because they were threats who would never stop fighting. But he spared King Guy and the other nobles because he could ransom them. He let the civilians in Jerusalem leave because a massacre would have united all of Europe against him. Saladin wasn't just a great general, he was a great politician. But there's something else that made Hattin so devastating. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a spiritual one. The Christians believed God was on their side. They carried the true cross into battle as proof. When they lost the cross, when their army was destroyed, when Jerusalem fell, it shook their faith. How could God let this happen? How could the righteous lose to the infidels? Some Christians decided they must have sinned. They must have angered God. The loss was punishment. Others decided they needed to fight harder, be more faithful, launch more crusades. But everyone agreed that Hattin was a disaster sent from heaven. For Muslims, it was the opposite. Saladin became a hero. He'd united the Muslim world and defeated the invaders. He'd recaptured Jerusalem, the third holiest city in Islam. He'd done what generations of Muslim leaders had failed to do. Hattin wasn't just a battle, it was proof that God favored the Muslims. This is what made the battle so important. It wasn't just about land or castles or cities. It was about faith. Both sides believed God would decide the winner. And at Hattin, it seemed like God had spoken. But here's the final twist. The battle that made Saladin a legend almost didn't happen. If Reginald hadn't attacked that caravan, there might have been peace. If King Guy had been stronger, he might have punished Reginald and kept the truce. If the Christian commanders had stayed at Safaria, Saladin might never have gotten his chance to destroy them. History turned on a few bad decisions made by proud, stupid men. Reginald wanted gold. King Guy wanted respect. Gerard de Riedfort wanted glory. They got none of those things. What they got was disaster. 20,000 men marched out of Safaria on July 3rd, 1187. Most of them never came home. They died on a rocky hillside, choking on smoke, mad with thirst, surrounded by enemies. They died because their leaders were fools. They died because Saladin was brilliant. They died because sometimes, in war, one side does everything wrong and the other side does everything right. Saladin destroyed the Crusader kingdoms. But what happened to the greatest Christian city of all? Constantinople had walls so thick that no army could break them, until a 22-year-old sultan showed up with a plan no one had ever tried before. Want to know what he did? Watch this video next.